All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 30, The Recent Past. So, as we make it to the last chapter of the American Yacht book here, we are confronted with, typically when we get to the end of American history, the intersection between history, which typically is a study of the past, and current events. And to be quite honest, it's not always clear exactly where the distinction is, right? Where do current events end and where does history begin? I will say that, in this chapter and just, looking at the recent past more broadly, typically as historians, we do like for a little bit of time to pass before we can analyze certain events, certain people, certain incidents, so that we have a better understanding of those events. And so, again, one point to make here is that considering much of what is covered in this chapter is somewhat recent, means that it will continue to be open to interpretation moving forward. Now, that's true of history more broadly. As things change, our understandings and interpretations of the past do change. But again, we are in somewhat of, I would say, uncomfortable territory of making the transition from current events to history. And as more time goes on, as more time passes, we will no doubt develop a better understanding about some of these events that really have happened since the ending of the Cold War. So recall that more or less this chapter here picks up after the Cold War. Now, as time has gone on, it certainly feels as if, or it doesn't just feel, but the Cold War is becoming, I can write it correctly here, becoming an event of the past, right? A decade ago, 10 years ago, it was a little bit more of the recent past. 20 years ago, it might have been considered a current event. But there is without a doubt that 1989 is one of those years that marks a new era in history. However, though, still, that's 35 years ago. 35 years have passed since the ending of the Cold War. And I would say that, I think historians are still trying to figure out exactly how we define and characterize this post Cold War world. So, this chapter attempts to tackle the U.S. history from 1989 up until the present day. And we're introduced, or in the introduction of this chapter, we are presented with a photograph and an event that is very, very recent, and that is January 6th, 2021. We can go ahead and just say a little bit of background about the incident at the U.S. Capitol, the breaching of the Capitol here on January 6th, 2021. That the context of this was the 2016, not 2016, sorry, that's wrong, 2020 election, presidential election of Joe Biden, the Democrat, defeated uh, Donald Trump, the Republican. And it was the losing of this election, Joe Biden's victory over Donald Trump and Donald Trump losing the election, that was the catalyst for the event that you see in this image here. What occurred was that Trump supporters, we'll use the term here in the image, breached the U.S. Capitol building in order to, quote unquote, stop the steal. And what they meant by that was to stop the certification of Joe Biden's victory. Believing that the election had been stolen, that Joe Biden had won the election either unfairly or via some sort of conspiracy. They didn't believe that Donald Trump, the guy that they wanted to win the presidency, that he lost legitimately. And so they stormed the Capitol building in order to prevent the election from being certified. Donald Trump told his supporters who stormed the Capitol in the, probably an hour earlier or something like that. He said, quote, "Fight like hell. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Donald Trump, 2021. So the breaching of the Capitol building, January 6, 2021, this is one of those examples of, it's certainly an event that we can identify as it was unfolding, as unprecedented as it was, the amount of coverage that was possible due to the technological innovations, especially stuff like cell phones and the internet and social media. Certainly something that we can recognize as a historical event. And historians and I think even the textbook do try to provide a historical analysis and causation of this event. But this is one of those incidents that I think as time goes on, we will have a better understanding what the historical significance of this particular incident is. But I think everyone who saw it unfolding at the time, for those that can remember it, we no doubtedly understood this to be historically significant, right? That this would end up in American history textbooks from this point forward. Again, as far as historians are concerned, typically, a little bit more time provides us with a little bit more ability to analyze and understand and kind of flesh out the details of such an incident. So looking at the buildup to this event in 2021, again, we're picking up American history beyond 1989. Now, had this textbook been written before, had this textbook book been written before 2021? Actually, I can actually go check this. So as I was going to say, and I actually did check this, and I'm quite proud of myself because I'm correct. What I was going to say is that had this textbook been written before 2021, it probably would have focused on the events of September 11th, 2001, because following the Cold War, that has been undoubtedly the most significant historical event. And sure enough, looking in the Wayback Machine, Chapter 30, the recent past. The textbook prior to 2021 had made the introduction image the Twin Towers, which were part of the September 11th, 2001 attack. So again, this provides us an example of how modern day events shape our interpretation and understandings about history, um, and how in this time period, because so much of what is unfolding is considered current events. I would say that if you had taken 10 or 15 different American history textbooks, the first 29 chapters of all those are going to be pretty similar, but the last chapter you're going to get a lot of variation. It's because we don't quite have that clear distinction between history and current events. So I'm proud of myself for that prediction. Um, so the first section here is America before September 11th, 2001, and we'll talk a little bit more about the significance of that date. But arguably it's the most important historical event since the ending of the Cold War. But moving on from 1989, we have a little bit of domestic history going on here. So, Ronald Reagan, who defined the decade of the 1980s, 1980 to 1988, his ideology encapsulated by the New Right or the New Conservative Movement. A lot of those ideas continue to be popular in the 1990s, including who succeeds him as president, and that is George H.W. Bush. He is the Republican. He's going to be president from 1988 till 1992. And we'll say he is Reagan's vice president, or was Reagan's vice president, now president. And this was a continuation of Reagan's popularity. including economic policies. And so when George H.W. Bush was elected, the quote that is often associated with him, read my lips, no new taxes. George H.W. Bush quote. Now, the problem for H.W., because he does, he does represent Reagan's popularity, but he only serves for one term. So it's not, the wave that Reagan created, but, Bush can't ride it for all that long. He eventually broke that promise. And for some Americans, that was reason to turn away from Bush, or one of the reasons. Now, of course, on the foreign policy stage, it's not just the ending of the Cold War, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was finalized under the Bush presidency, and not just for those people living at the time, but really for people ever since. We still are trying to define that era. So, for example, one historian put it right, Francis Fukuyama said, quote, about the falling of the Soviet Union: what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post war history, but the end of history as such. And of course, the big question was, now what? Right? Now, what was going to follow the collapse of the Soviet Union as far as the world was concerned? Some people said, is this just the end of history? Like as we know it, there had been kind of this constant struggle between nation states going all the way back to, I don't know, like the 1500s. And at the end of the day, through World War I, through World War II, through the Cold War, only one country reigned supreme, and that was the United States. And so was this, some people suggested, is this an American era? Right? It's like, is the United States just reign supreme on the global stage? They're the only single superpower that are left. Some suggested something called a clash of civilizations, that no longer would it be nation states, but various civilizations of the world that are clashing together. George H.W. Bush claimed a new world order. Right? This was H.W. Bush, the president. Oops, yeah, H.W. Bush. So yeah, I mean, there was this, this question of, this question of now what, and especially as far as American foreign policy is concerned, the key question for the United States is that, remember, all those things from, like 4 or 5 chapters ago, the Truman Doctrine, containment, domino theory, all of those things motivated American foreign policy for the better part of 40 years. Now the Cold War is over. So what does the United States do? Does it go back to isolationism? Or does the United States continue to intervene? Right? Intervention. Well, Americans and the world would get their answer in a very short amount of time. In fact, less than a year after the falling apart of the Soviet Union, the United States would engage in a global conflict that would really pave the way for an interventionist, right? So, this question, what's the answer to this question? Isolation or intervention after the Cold War? So far, it's looked more like this, right? You could probably make the stronger argument for intervention. And the first place that it happened in is in Iraq. Now, recall Iraq, it's a Middle Eastern nation that actually had US support in the 1980s. Fighting Iran. But Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, a leader of Iraq, invaded the country of Kuwait. Kuwait, we'll just call them a small, oil-rich nation backed by Iraq. And so Saddam Hussein, probably anticipated that the United States wasn't going to have nearly as much as an interventionist response as they did, because the response by the United States, by Iraq's invasion of the smaller country of Kuwait, was Operation Desert Storm, which happened in 19. And this was the U.S. Military intervention against Iraq. Now, as far as Operation Desert Storm went, there were several things that made Operation Desert Storm arguably the most successful military intervention in all of American history. It was a quick victory. In fact, I think that your textbook, or that the textbook states that it was only 100 hours it took for the entire Iraqi army to be completely demolished, but also had broad support, meaning Democrats, Republicans, and foreign nations all agreed that what Iraq did was wrong and that the United States was justified in their intervention. And so there was broad support, including, President H.W. Bush at the time, who had record support numbers for Operation Desert Storm. But, when we zoom out and kind of look at the bigger picture, it was important because it sort of laid the stage for American intervention in the world. And that was, the U.S. wasn't going to retreat back into an isolationist position following the ending of the Cold War, despite, communism no longer being a threat. Now, there was an important decision that was made during Operation Desert Storm, which didn't seem like that big of a deal at the time, but would turn out to have repercussions in the future. And that is the U.S., to be honest, probably not many people would have criticized this at the time, although I'm sure you could find few, but the U.S. did not invade Iraq, or we'll say invade. We'll say invade and occupy Iraq, and did not regime change, kick out Saddam Hussein. Right, this was purely a military action designed to, push the invaders, push the Iraqis out of Kuwait, secure Kuwait's protection. After that, Iraq and Saddam Hussein were more or less left on their own. Now, despite the fact that George H.W. Bush was experiencing a very high level of approval, when it came down to the 1992 election, it didn't go well for George H.W. Bush and the Republicans, and there were several reasons for that. So the 1992 election, this was H.W. Bush. And the reason why we're saying H.W. is because there are two George Bushes that are president, the father and the son. This one is the father. He was running up against Bill Clinton, the Democrat. But there was also a third party candidate, Ross Perot. And Ross Perot, independent, would play somewhat of a spoiler. Some of the people who would normally have voted for Bush end up casting their ballot for Ross Perot. But the eventual winner of the 1992 election was Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat. And this is what made Clinton really appealing during this, was that he was able to capture some of the things that made Ronald Reagan popular. That was the charisma. Bill Clinton was young, charismatic, and he was governor of Arkansas. So he was, a Southern Democrat. So kind of, hearkening back to an earlier political era, and that, that helped him get some sway or some approval in the South. Clinton's slogan for running for office was "It's the economy, stupid," and that is to say that Clinton ran on economic issues right? Sometimes they call these quote unquote kitchen table issues. And this was a little bit of a departure from the 1980s because remember in the 1980s, a really big part of the American discourse was the culture wars, right? Where do you stand on abortion? Where do you stand on homosexuality? Where do you stand on pornography and prayer in the classroom? And, Clinton said, look, yes, these things might be important, but at the end of the day, if Americans don't have enough food to put on their kitchen table, none of these things matter, right? In some sense, look, it's the economy, stupid, right? That's the thing that Americans care about at the end of the day. And that was good enough to get Bill Clinton elected in 1992. Now, with that being said, Clinton is often described as a centrist president, meaning that many ideas that were part of the new right, say, uh, well, let's make this simpler, right? And a centrist is, someone between. This will drive me insane if I write new right on the left-hand side. So let's put new left on the left and the new right on one side. And that is, Clinton trying to occupy a position that was, kind of between these two areas. And so we can see this reflected in the politics of the 1990s, and we can even see it reflected in the policies that Clinton has. So, for example, those or some of those that supported Clinton might have identified themselves as new Democrats, right? What did it mean to be a new Democrat? Well, this meant open to conservative economic policies. And it was Bill Clinton that signed maybe the most recognizable free trade agreement. Now, part of the new right, again, remember libertarian economics, free trade. This is something that we associate or should associate with, presidents like Reagan and with the Republican Party. But it was Bill Clinton and the Democrats that passed NAFTA, which again is probably the most recognizable free trade policy the United States has maybe ever had. NAFTA stands for North American Free Trade Agreement, Clinton policy. And this, we'll say, eliminated trade barriers between US, Mexico, and Canada. Again, this would typically free trade is something that we might associate with the new right, but Bill Clinton was willing to, even though he was the Democratic Party and the Democrats represent the ideas of the new left, he was more willing to entertain some of these ideas. Socially, the United States was going through ever since 1965. Recall under Johnson's Immigration Act of 1965 no longer made national origin a requirement for immigration, and you had an increase in immigration after this period. Immigration continues to accelerate into the 1980s and 1990s. So, for example, as far as immigration is concerned, we're just going to do a breakdown from 1990 to 2010. So, one category we can go to foreign-born. In terms of those who were born outside or inside of the United States. So 1990, that was 8%. By 2010, that had grown to 13%. And those who were undocumented, right, that had come to the United States illegally, in 1990, it was 3.5 million people. By 2010, it had grown to 11.2 million. So immigration becomes one of these topics, one of these political topics in the 90s and the 2000s, and even today, right? It remains to be one of the central issues as far as politics is concerned. And we can see that immigration was growing, significantly from this period. Another good example of Clinton's more centrist approach came to the policy of don't ask, don't tell. This was Clinton's policy of gays in the military. And so there was a conversation about whether homosexual men should be allowed to serve in the military. But it went beyond just allowed to serve or should serve, but it was, if they do serve, which again, not all Americans agreed on that, first of all. But if they do serve in the military, should they be open about their sexual orientation? And so, Bill Clinton's middle of the road policy was don't ask, don't tell. And that was to say, well, look, the military is not going to ask you about your sexual orientation, but also for those who are in the U.S. military, that they should not disclose whether or not they are straight or gay. So this was Clinton's policy of gays in the military, signaled Clinton's, say, centrist approach. As far as the economy is concerned, as we talked about in an earlier period, the economy, for the most part, does pretty well. (1980) till about 2000. In fact, we have here what might be one of the first major blips in the economy, although the economy does pick back up after the year 2000 pretty well. And that is a lot of what is fueling the economic growth is a massive shift in technology. We talked about it a little bit earlier with things like cable TV and and personal computers. The tech boom, excuse me, only continues to grow. So this is the economic growth due to technology. So we're talking about companies like Apple. Again, Apple probably one of the most valuable and richest countries or wealthiest companies in the world today. Microsoft, and the entire economy related to the internet, right? And again, this comes maybe a little bit later, but companies like Amazon, again, one of the biggest companies ever. Again, not quite the 1990s, but Facebook, Google. Some of these companies, Apple and Microsoft, they provided the hardware, like the personal computer and the iPhone and stuff like that. But once the internet took off, right? Once you could access the internet through, Microsoft technically is a software. Sorry, it's an operating system. But once that took off, then you had these giant internet companies, right? Especially Amazon and Google. Those ones are a little bit older. Facebook is a little bit more recent, but it was, the tech boom, again, accelerated the American economy. It was the building of wealth for some of the most valuable companies that we have even to this day. But because a lot of this technology was new, a lot of people didn't really know the extent to which the internet was worth it. And there was a lot of speculation about the future value of the internet, right? How central was it going to be? And if you were one of those lucky investors to invest in Amazon or Google when they started, you're probably a millionaire or billionaire by now. But a lot of companies didn't make it, right? For every Amazon and Google, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of failed internet companies. And in the early 2000s, there was this over speculation into websites known as the dot-com boom, and then the subsequent dot-com bust. And this was, we might say, speculative investments into, they were pretty much websites at the time. And the idea was, well, how much is a website worth? Well, or how much is a website going to be worth in the future? And again, the internet being somewhat new, a lot of people understood that the internet was revolutionary, but there was no ceiling, right? People didn't really see a ceiling or a max to which this, this economic growth or this internet thing could take off. So it turns out that at the end of the day, websites themselves actually aren't that valuable. Like the actual name of the website doesn't give you too much. It's the search engine that's valuable, right? You only need to know one website. That's Google. And then you just type it into Google and Google will send you everywhere. So this was before Google, right? Before Google and other search engines had, Google is the only search engine really, had, changed the internet landscape. The most famous example was pets.com, right? So again, in an era before Google, how would people know where to find a website about their pets? Well, the most logical conclusion is they would just type the name .com. And so how much would a website called pets.com be worth? Well, today, not all that much, but back then, they thought that it would be worth, millions, if not billions of dollars. So the dot-com boom was when all of this money was going into all these websites, anticipating they were going to be worth a lot of money. Turns out they weren't, and the economy crashed in the year 2000. So when we say the, there was strong economic growth from 1980 to 2000, the 2000 is the dot-com bust, right? When that bubble burst, and then it caused all sorts of other economic problems. Again, a pretty fast economic recovery after that, admittedly, but yeah, that's one marker to put. So, broadly speaking, Bill Clinton's charisma, Bill Clinton's, thriving economy, Bill Clinton's centrist approach, although he had a lot of political enemies, but his willingness to, entertain the Republican side, meant that he had a pretty popular and successful presidency. That was until the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which in a lot of ways not just hurt Bill Clinton's popularity at the time, but in some ways would forever tarnish his legacy. Monica Lewinsky was a young White House intern. Bill Clinton, Lewinsky and Bill Clinton were having a sexual affair with each other, and Bill Clinton was under investigation for some sort of sexual misconduct action or behavior when he was governor of Arkansas. And so they were investigating him and people around him. And one of the questions during this investigation was, are you currently having any sexual affairs with, people that you work with? And both Lewinsky and Bill Clinton lied. And it was lying under oath that would eventually be what Congress can impeach Bill Clinton about. So the Monica Lewinsky scandal, this is when Bill Clinton lied under oath to Congress about his sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky. Congress, the House of Representatives, which was controlled by the Republicans at the time, impeached Clinton. And remember that impeachment is part of our separation of powers. To impeach someone means to remove from office. So the House of Representatives wanted to get rid of Bill Clinton. But there's two parts to impeachment. The House of Representatives votes whether or not to impeach. If the vote is yes to impeach, then it's the Senate that gets to vote whether or not to kick them out. And at the time, the Senate, which was controlled by Democrats, voted to keep Clinton. So even though Clinton was able to serve out the rest of his presidency, the Monica Lewinsky scandal went a long way in, tarnishing Clinton. And, the presidency. A lot of Americans were really offended by the whole thing, especially when a lot of the details came out about the type of affair, the fact that Clinton would lie, not just to Congress, but to the American public. There's a very kind of embarrassing and humbling moment when Bill Clinton did have to come clean to the American public and say that, said that he did lie and he did have a sexual relation or inappropriate relation. So that really, tarnished otherwise what was a very successful presidency up until that point. Now, regardless, though, most Americans felt that the impeachment trials were a little bit too far. That, yeah, maybe they don't condone Bill Clinton's behavior, but this was not a quote unquote high crime and misdemeanor. that is worth kicking Bill Clinton out. Most Americans, or some Americans, saw it as a political vendetta, right? That the House of Representatives were kicking Clinton out because he was a Democrat, and they didn't, they were very much partisan at the time. The election that would follow Clinton's presidency, Clinton wins re-election, so he has a very successful, or at least in terms of winning re-election. He does serve for most of the 1990s, from 1992 until 2000. The 2000 election would be one of the closest and most controversial in U.S. history. It put Al Gore, who was running for the Democratic candidate. Al Gore was Clinton's VP, right? Clinton's vice president, running on the popularity of Clinton. Especially the economy, right? But Al Gore suffered from the same thing that George H.W. Bush suffered from, right? George H.W. Bush was the vice president following up a very popular Reagan presidency. Al Gore was following up a very popular Clinton presidency. And that was, he just wasn't as likable, right? Or charismatic, right? Bill Clinton was a cool guy. He was young. He played the saxophone. There was a certain appeal, a likability that Bill Clinton had. Al Gore, he's, for the trade-offs that it has, he was much more of an intellectual. He didn't really connect with Americans in the same way that Bill Clinton did, but he had been Clinton's VP, and if Americans approved, the economy in the 1990s, then Democrats were hoping that they would elect Al Gore. He was running against George W. Bush. This is George Bush Jr., sometimes called just W. Bush, 43 Bush, being the 43rd president. And George W. Bush, again, son of a president. And George W. Bush was a little bit more down to earth. He wore a cowboy hat, he wore cowboy boots, he had a Southern drawl. He had been a manager of like a baseball team, I think. There was a certain charisma and likability. Your textbook says that Al Gore, one of the reasons he didn't get elected, because Al Gore does eventually lose this race, was that he was being questioned that he wasn't alpha male enough. So apparently George W. Bush not only had charisma, but he was the alpha male. So that helped him in this presidency. And really the core constituency that supported W. Bush was, and this is the strategy that Bush followed, was a broader faith-based politics. And that was W. Bush appealed to churches and clergy. He, what could we say? He wanted to restore at least in his eyes, honor and integrity to a really a disgraced office. And this was in reference to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He'd ran himself as the candidate of religion, and the faith-based politics was very effective in really bringing out that base of the religious right that had supported Reagan in the past, and the appeals to Christianity, the appeals to notions of honor, integrity. That was one of the major backbones of the George W. Bush campaign. Now, that all being said, Bush, the charismatic alpha male Christian guy, against Al Gore, the intellectual, good running economy vice president, it was a very, very, very close election. And in fact, the entire election came down to the state of Florida, and Florida would decide the outcome of the 2000 election. So when election night rolled around, all of the other votes had been tallied. Bush won about half the states. Gore won about half the states. And it was only in Florida that the vote was too close to call. So the next day comes around, and now everyone's waiting for Florida. If it turns out that Bush wins Florida, Bush wins the election. If it turns out that Gore wins Florida, Gore wins the election. Well, being too close to call, each side, we'll say each side, demanded recounts. Each side sued, each side brought in their lawyers, and you had a very contested election, right? And you can imagine, I think at the end of the day, I think there was only like 300 votes that separated like 16 million votes or something ridiculous like that. But whenever the tallies would come in, whatever side ended up barely losing, the other side demanded a recount, and you had lawyers and all these other people arguing the outcome of the election. It went on for days and even weeks after the election was over, and we still didn't have a president. That's when the Supreme Court weighed in, and the Supreme Court would weigh in on this decision in Bush versus Gore. And essentially what the Supreme Court said is, look, we can't just keep recounting and recounting and recounting. We're going to need a president, and we're going to need a president pretty soon. And so the Supreme Court ruled George W. Bush the next president, which he became. George W. Bush would George W. Bush would be inaugurated in early 2001, being the 43rd president of the United States. Section 3, September 11th and the War on Terror. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the United States experienced the most significant attack on its home soil since the beginning of World War II, and that was in the form of the September 11th attack, when 19 people hijacked 4 passenger airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Centers, which were very tall buildings in the middle of New York City. The World Trade Center represented, in a lot of ways, the American economy. One was crashed into the U.S. Pentagon, which is the headquarters to the U.S. military. And one plane crashed in a field when passengers fought back. In total, 3,000 Americans were killed. The group responsible for the September 11th attacks on U.S. soil was Al Qaeda, which we'll go ahead and call a radical Islamist international, meaning they operate in multiple countries, terrorist organization. And what is interesting about Al Qaeda is that they had, in fact, targeted the United States in the past. In fact, they had targeted multiple times in the past. But those attacks were not anywhere near as big and deadly as the September 11th attacks. But we might just say about Al Qaeda, they were responsible for several attacks on the U.S. before 9/11. Let's not. Radical Islamist International Organization. Who will say who did 9/11 at that point? The leader of Al Qaeda was Bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, leader of Al Qaeda. He was from a wealthy Saudi family and held anti-American, anti-Western views, say Western ideology. Immediately following the September 11th attacks, the United States declared what was known as the War on Terror. And the War on Terror was the U.S. war on not just Al Qaeda, but other similar organizations and their allies. And that was an important part too. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the president at the time, George W. Bush, made it very clear to the to the rest of the world that you're either with us or against us in this war on terror. And following the September 11th attacks, the United States garnered a lot of international sympathy. Especially early on, and some of the early activity that the United States had in the war on terror. There wasn't really a lot of controversy around it. It would only be later, in some of the later conflicts, that more controversy would arise. George W. Bush said in response to the attacks in 2001, speaking to a crowd in New York on the rubble of the Twin Towers that were destroyed, somebody from the crowd yelled to him, that I can't hear you. George Bush responded, "The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." One of the first targets, we might say, or one of the first organizations outside of Al Qaeda that came into the crosshairs of the United States in this war on terror was the Taliban. Now, the Taliban and Al Qaeda are technically two different things. The Taliban, this is the government of Afghanistan, and they provided sanctuary to bin Laden and Al Qaeda. In response, in this war on terror, and we might be able to make these two synonymous, right? The war on terror and Bush doctrine. The United States took a pretty dramatically different position as far as foreign policy is concerned. And what resulted after the September 11th attacks was the Bush doctrine. And that was the doctrine in which the U.S. can and should unilaterally, what unilaterally means is by themselves, without any other international support, unilaterally and preemptively. And that means without any type of maybe provoking attack preemptively. I mean, the provoking attack would have been the attacks on September 11th, but the idea is that the United States really didn't have to wait around for the next terrorist attack to happen. If there were organizations out there that were hostile, capable, and willing of doing harm to the United States, then the United States and George W. Bush said, look, we're not going to wait for the next attack to happen. We're going to go after terrorist organizations and governments that are sympathetic to them. So unilateral and preemptive war on any threat to the U.S. And so while organizations like Al Qaeda proved to be more elusive, right? Al Qaeda, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, is an international organization. They operate within countries. In some sense, we might call Al Qaeda kind of like a moving target. The target that was not so mobile or not so moving was the Taliban, which was simply just the government of Afghanistan and their willingness and ability to harbor people like bin Laden and people like Al Qaeda who had carried out the September 11th attacks and made Afghanistan the first arena or first target of the war on terror. In Afghanistan, the U.S. declared war and occupied Afghanistan. Really, I mean, depending on how you want to, I mean, there's some nuances in between, but for the better part of 20 years, the United States would be off and on in Afghanistan. And the reason why the United States went in there to begin with was to get rid of the Taliban government and to go and find and kill the people that were responsible or had any connection to the September 11th attacks. Now, what is somewhat interesting about Afghanistan is that in just 2 decades earlier, the United States was also in Afghanistan, but they were supporting some of the same demographics that now were adversaries to the United States. So groups like the Mujahideen, these we're going to call them um, Islamist fighters that the U.S. supported in the 1980s to defeat Soviets. Again, it's not a one-on-one comparison, but it is. The Mujahideen was victorious. The Soviet Union was forced to withdraw, and there was a period between Soviet withdrawal and 2001. But for the most part, a lot of those that would have been part of the Mujahideen went on to create the Taliban. In fact, one of the people who was fighting against the Soviet Union was Osama bin Laden. Right? Bin Laden also supported the Mujahideen in the 1980s, but he did it for very different reasons. The United States did it to defeat communism. Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen, they saw themselves very much more in a religious struggle, right? And this is some of the ways in which the United States was so encapsulated by the Cold War, they couldn't quite understand any other interpretations of the world, like the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East. But in the post-Cold War world, this becomes more, more clear, right? More clear. The official title of the invasion is in Afghanistan is called Operation Enduring Freedom. So this is the name for the war and occupation of Afghanistan. And again, for the Afghanistan war, widespread support. Democrats, Republicans, Americans, people living in different countries, United Nations. Um, the war in Afghanistan was less controversial. The more controversial conflict was the Iraq War, and the Iraq War, in a lot of ways, would maybe taint the legacy of George W. Bush, again, who had gotten pretty high approval ratings following the immediate attacks that occurred in September 11th. But Iraq at the time, remember that Saddam Hussein, we'd mentioned earlier that the fact that the United States had left Saddam Hussein in power would come back here in the next section. Well, here it is again. As far as the Iraq goes, U.S.-Iraq relations were tense since the Gulf War. There was already a sense that these two nations don't and are not on friendly terms. And the idea was that in uh, the post September 11th era, that the United States has to be especially vigilant in monitoring nations that are and have a hostile history with the United States, like Iraq. And so Iraq came under the microscope. And the Bush administration at the time, claimed that Iraq and Hussein were making, or called WMD, which stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction. And the way that George W. Bush put it, with the Bush Doctrine in action, that it wasn't acceptable for the United States to simply stand by and just let Saddam Hussein develop these weapons, for these weapons to fall into the wrong hands, and then for them to be used on American citizens. Bush used the language of a mushroom cloud, right? He told the American public, what do we have to do? Just wait for a mushroom cloud to blow up in an American city before we declare war? But the debate over weapons of mass destruction didn't have the same type of support that Afghanistan did. So, for example, when it came to the WMD, again, the Bush administration claimed that Iraq had these. The United Nations wanted inspections, right? They wanted to be able to go in to Iraq and inspect any facilities that they might suspect making these weapons, versus the United States, which wanted regime change. And at the end of the day, the United States did not wait for international support like it had in Afghanistan, like it had in Iraq War I, and with what was called a coalition of the willing. That is, if you're with us, you're with us. And if you're not, we're not waiting for you. With the coalition of the willing, the United States Congress passed authorization for the use of force, for the use of military force against Iraq in 2003. This was the starting of the war in Iraq. So this was, we'll say, allowed, permitted U.S. war in Iraq. Protests broke out. Some members of Congress voted no. I think when it came to the authorization for war in Afghanistan, I think there was only one no vote. Something very low. But this one was a little bit less clear, right? Do you stand on the side of wanting more inspections, or do you stand on, well, the United States should be able to unilaterally and preemptively go to war with Iraq to prevent perhaps some grave future harm? So it ended up being the war in Iraq that was much more controversial. Yet on the military front, the United States was incredibly successful again. The capital city of Baghdad, Iraq, Baghdad is the capital, fell in 3 weeks. Bush claimed mission accomplished, as is demonstrated in this photo here. But the defeat of the Iraqi army and the regime change that took place, that was the easy part. Same thing in Afghanistan. Getting rid of the Taliban was the easy part. The hard part, the longer part, the bloodier part, the more controversial part was the occupation. And much like Afghanistan, the United States would occupy Iraq for at least the next 10 years. The U.S. would fight a deadly insurgency. In fact, most Americans who died in Iraq did not die during the initial war, but would die in the preceding insurgency. Hussein, for what it's worth, was captured and executed. But, both Iraq and Afghanistan, what started off as, conflicts that had very strong support initially in 2001 and 2003, respectively, for every single year that passed, and as for every year that Americans occupied these two territories, more and more Americans began to question the policy of occupation and naval building, and especially in relationship to Iraq, because when it came to Iraq, probably the punchline here is that no weapons of mass destruction were found. So many Americans were asking themselves, okay, well, what was this war all about if the reason for American intervention, the WMD, if that wasn't found or we weren't able to verify what was initially put out at the beginning of the war, Americans would turn against the war in Iraq and, more broadly speaking, turn against the presidency of George W. Bush. Section 4, the end of the Bush years. So George W. Bush was in office from 2000 to 2000. And what's somewhat interesting about Bush's presidency is that when he actually ran for office, he ran on a campaign of a less interventionist foreign policy. He wanted to dial back American intervention around the world. But the September 11th attacks, which happened in 2001, within a year of him taking office, and the subsequent war on terror completely dominated the Bush presidency, right? The war on terror, we'll say, dominated the Bush presidency. And, there were a lot of outstanding questions as the years passed on. So Americans asked, okay, where are the weapons of mass destruction? Where is Osama bin Laden? What to do about the Iraq and Afghanistan insurgency? Especially in places like Iraq, where George Bush had claimed mission accomplished way back in 2003, and all the way through the end of Bush's presidency, 2008, American forces were still dealing with violence on the ground in places like Iraq. An even bigger question, maybe around the war on terror, was not just the impact that it had overseas, but also the impact that it had at home. And to what degree does the United States have the power and capability to find those who are suspected of belonging to terrorist organizations and wanting to do harm against the United States? And probably one of the areas that was at the center of that conversation was Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, this was a prison for suspected terror suspects in Cuba, right? So Cuba is where it was located. And what was at the center of the conversation was the type of treatment that those who were suspected of terrorism were subject to. And this was a much broader conversation about the use of torture versus what was the official line, and that was the enhanced interrogation. With the memory of September 11th, very fresh in the minds of most Americans, a lot of the conversation was, to what degree should the United States go in terms of using things like torture, enhanced interrogation, whatever you want to call it. Waterboarding was a very popular technique at the time. And, the more and more that time went on, the longer that WMDs, were undiscovered, the longer that Osama bin Laden remained at large, the longer that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan continued, the presidency of George W. Bush became more and more unpopular, and he became more of a controversial figure. And by the time that he leaves office, he doesn't have very strong approval ratings. Now, as far as Iraq is concerned, the conflict in Iraq, we could say, was put to rest in 2011. So American forces did have to, in some sense, re-enter Iraq in 2007. U.S. troops surged in Iraq to deal with the insurgency. And by 2011, U.S. troops had left the country. In the case of Afghanistan, again, kind of, over the years, there have been surges and withdrawals and surges and withdrawals. Afghanistan, the last, I think it was 2021 was when, or maybe it might be a little bit later than that. We'll say 2022, but a little bit more recently. Combined with the continuation of the war on terror and the controversies and debates surrounding it, there was also a major domestic crisis that also hurt George W. Bush's presidency and his popularity, and that was Hurricane Katrina. This was a large natural disaster in New Orleans that left many Americans, many of them who were predominantly many Black Americans, without homes. It killed a number of people as well. And Bush was criticized for, we'll say, mismanagement of the crisis. Here is a image of, I think it's, what is it called? The Astrodome Stadium. Like a giant baseball stadium in Louisiana, or at least it used to. I think they destroyed it. I think they also played football in it. Right? No, they don't play baseball in ones. A giant football stadium. And you can see all the people who were displaced by, by Hurricane Katrina. 2008 was the last year of the Bush presidency, but it was also the first significant, excuse me, not the first, but the worst significant economic downturn since the Great Depression, and that was the Great Recession in 2008. So 2008 ended up being a pretty a pretty rocky year as far as the economy was concerned. And the causes of the Great Depression, or sorry, the causes of the Great Recession are a little bit easier to pinpoint because a lot of it, or pretty much all of it, was in the housing market and the housing bubble that had been building up until this point. And a bubble, when we talk about bubbles economically, it typically means that people believe that a certain industry or a certain section of the economy is worth more money than it actually is. So we talked earlier about the dot-com bubble, and that was when tons of money poured into dot-com websites, believing that they would be worth billions upon millions of dollars in the future, when it turned out they weren't worth that. The same thing happened to housing in the 2000s, and the reasons behind it are a little bit more complicated than the dot-com bubble, but we can pretty much summarize them here. So home prices, we'll say, were incredibly inflated by 2008, right? Meaning that the home prices were much, much, much higher than what they should be. Well, the question is, how did they get that way? Well, they got that way through a combination of two things. One is called the mortgage-backed security. See, when you buy a home, you take out a loan called a mortgage or home mortgage. Now, mortgages were historically seen as a very safe loan. That is, most people who take out a mortgage are going to pay it because that's the number one priority for them. Before you pay for the car, before you pay for food, before you pay for anything else, you're most likely going to pay back your mortgages. Well, mortgages, then the money that was provided by loans, those things were packaged up and sold as a security, which is kind of like an investment. And so the more mortgages that banks could give out, right, the more houses that they sold, the more that these securities were worth and the more profits that banking could get. Combined with deregulation, it meant that home loans or mortgages, right, or we'll say inflated and risky mortgages were made to increase the profits from mortgage-backed securities. Again, historically, we would think that mortgages are safe, and that's what most people thought at the time. But because these mortgage-backed securities could, get a lot of profit for the banks, you had lenders who were giving mortgages to people who couldn't afford them, who had no chance of paying it back. You had people buying homes when they didn't have really any business buying houses. And again, the idea was that, of course, everyone's going to pay back their mortgage. Well, in 2008, the house of cards fell, and people were no longer able to pay back their mortgages. They had taken loans. They had taken a loan out of $1 million house, and the house, when a crash happened in 2008, the value of that house was now maybe only worth 500,000. So you borrowed $1 million for something that is only worth $500,000, right? And so there are a lot of people who are underwater. There are a lot of banks that were underwater. A lot of these mortgage-backed securities were packaged and then sold off in various sectors of the economy. So when the housing bubble burst, right, when home prices declined because all these mortgages were inflated and risky to begin with, the whole economy went down. And some well-established financial institutions bit the dust. And two of the most famous ones were Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. These were established banks. I think Lehman Brothers had been around for over 100 years, failed. And the response to the Great Recession, the response to the housing bubble and the failure of the financial system by both the Democrats and the Republicans was to bail out these financial institutions and bail out the businesses. We'll say Republican and Democrats passed laws and funding to save the businesses and banks. Well, most Americans were pretty angry about this. Not only for those people that owned homes, especially if you had one of these mortgages and your home price crashed. Even if you had a mortgage that was safe, generally speaking, Americans expect when they buy a house for their house to increase in value over time. And for millions of Americans who are homeowners, their homes were now worth a lot less than what they were a year before. And so it completely changes, for example, your outlook on things like retirement. Most people count on either selling their home or living in their home during retirement. It also meant with the crashing of financial institutions that a lot of businesses were forced to downsize. Employment went up. A lot of businesses laid off workers. And so Americans were angry. And the response from the government didn't help because these bailouts certainly looked like, from the perspective of a lot of average Americans, that the business and the government were taking care of each other. In fact, there were a lot of, this was an especially a focal point for a lot of anger, we might say. And that was what was called golden parachutes. And this was when, one of these, presidents or CEOs of one of these banks who had made these really stupid loans and had helped crash the economy, when the business provided funding to bail out those industries, some of them got very lucrative severance packages, right? These CEOs were forced out because they obviously had screwed up. But in leaving these banking industries, they were given these these very lucrative deals, millions of dollars, stock options. It was as if they ruined the economy and they got off scot-free, whereas the rest of Americans suffered the consequences. And so you had two different movements that formed as grassroots, kind of anti elite movements. That was the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. The Tea Party, this was the conservative, and at this time, mostly we're talking about Republican, grassroots, anti elite movement. And on the other side of the aisle was Occupy Wall Street. This was the liberal, democratic, anti-elite movement. Now, there were a lot of differences between these two groups, right? The Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. In fact, they differed very significantly when it came to almost every single political issue. But one thing that they both agreed upon was they very much viewed these bailouts as not the right thing to do, right? That this cooperation between business and government, that all these business leaders and politicians were getting off scot-free, this really created an anti-establishment, anti-elite type of populism in the United States from the Great Recession. Section 6, the Obama years. So Barack Obama assumed the presidency in 2008, following the presidency of George W. Bush. Obama was a Democrat, whereas Bush was a Republican. Obama had been a senator from Illinois. And one thing that really put him apart from even members of his own party was that from the very beginning, he had opposed the Iraq War. And the Iraq War had become, again, for a lot of Americans, had turned against George W. Bush and had turned against the war. It had become very, very unpopular. Barack Obama's victory in the 2008 presidential election made him the first African American to win not only a, we'll say, major party's nomination. That was a first. But also the first to win the presidency. Barack Obama would be in office from 2008 until 2016. As far as his most significant accomplishments go, probably in terms of his domestic program, it was the passage of Obamacare. Obamacare expanded government healthcare coverage. In terms of foreign policy, Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. He had remained essentially on the loose, ever since the September 11th attacks for the better part of 10 years. But not only Obama's presidency, but really a lot of the politics, ever since the Bill Clinton years, had become increasingly partisan. And part of the partisanship contributed to a certain degree of stagnation. That is, it seemed as if Americans could not make progress in some pretty key and important areas. So we might just make a point here that Obama and others failed to make progress due to partisanship. Right? And partisanship is your allegiance to political parties. So, for example, when Obama got reelected in 2012, Obama was the president, was the Democrat, but the Congress was Republican. And sometimes the president and the Congress, whether they belong to different political parties, sometimes they can get along and get stuff done and pass legislation. But Really ever since the 1990s when this occurs, and it's occurred more than just 2012, it becomes very difficult for the president to do anything. In fact, Obama's second term, right, from 2012 to 2016, because Congress was not willing to go along with him. Sometimes they refer to this as a lame duck period. The president's a quote unquote lame duck. I don't know where that word comes from, why it's a duck, but the idea is that they don't really get anything accomplished. And partisanship was not only hindering the ability to pass new laws or pass legislation, but it was also stagnating the country in other ways. One way in which stagnation carried on from the 2000 to the present was in terms of the economy. There certainly was a I wouldn't say that this is the only reason, but the Great Recession of 2008 continued to slow the economy. Things like the stock market increased, but wages, right, wages for the American worker, stayed the same. Essentially, I think your textbook says the average U.S. worker did not get a raise. And this is, of course, accounting for inflation, right? So if the price of everything goes up and then your wage goes up, that really doesn't mean you have an increase in your wage. It just means that inflation is occurring. So the point is, the average U.S. worker did not get a raise in 40 years in the U.S. And other issues like climate change also didn't see a lot of progress as far as the American political landscape was concerned. Climate change, we're going to call this the human caused warming of the planet. And the two political parties, the Republicans, took the position to essentially deny that it was happening. And the Democrats will say, climate change, or we'll just say that for Democrats, climate change was a priority. This was a very important issue. And so because the two sides couldn't necessarily agree on climate change, politically speaking, the textbook would point out that there hasn't really been a lot of progress on that particular issue. One of the things that brought the debate of climate change to the forefront of American politics was a movie called The Inconvenient Truth. And this was a movie about climate change, very popular at the time, by Al Gore, the former vice president, failed presidential candidate, and we'll just say caused a big debate on the topic. Section 8, American Carnage. So this section opens up with the 2016 presidential election, and the two candidates were running were in the side of the Republican Donald Trump. And before this, Donald Trump had been involved in the real estate business, a real estate developer. But he also had a very public persona. We might call him or your textbook describes him as a real estate developer and celebrity. Billionaire. So this was, in some sense, he had the same commonality as Ronald Reagan in having this celebrity background, and he could bring some of the charm and comedy and charisma from his background in the celebrity arena and bring it to politics. The slogan of the candidacy of Donald Trump in 2016 and onwards was to quote unquote make America great again, and this is the slogan or quote of the Trump presidency. And he was running for office in order to combat what he described as American carnage. And his presidency, or at least his, his positions and his appeal, were to address the following. So Donald Trump said, "quote the crime, the gangs, the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here, and it stops right now." Running against him was Hillary Clinton, who had a much longer and experienced career in politics. She had been the first lady and wife to former President Bill Clinton. But she also had a very long and well established career in politics. In fact, she had been 8 years, I guess whatever, 8 years a senator and 4 years as Secretary of State. And at the time in 2016, it mentions that, both Trump and Hillary Clinton running for their respective parties in this election, that both of them were not very well liked. In fact, when it turned to election time, most people voted against the person they hated more rather than for the person they actually liked more. So this was much more about who do you dislike and voting against the person that you dislike. Eventually, it was Donald Trump that won the 2016 election, and Donald Trump would be president from 2016 until 2020. So, in outlining his ability to stop American carnage, as he described it, there were three areas that Trump and his presidency primarily focused on. One was illegal immigration. And the response to illegal immigration was to build a wall on the US Mexico border. Right. And even, along with the slogan of Make America Great Again, build the wall was also a very popular chant that supporters of Donald Trump used. One was crime. And the idea was to create tough on crime laws. And the last section that we'll put is foreign economic competition. And this was how, Trump challenged the kind of conventional wisdom when it came to Republican politics at the time, because traditionally Republicans, and especially those under the new right, had favored free trade policies. But in order to deal with foreign economic competition, specifically China, who Donald Trump said was taking advantage of the United States economically, the United States wanted to, or Trump wanted to, Trump wanted to get, quote unquote, tough on trade. All right, this is what we would, and what do we mean by this? Well, we mean things like tariffs, to tax Chinese goods, and protectionist trade policies. So, in terms of the, this is a very simplified version, of course, but in terms of the core ideas that Trump was, running on, and the issues that his presidency focused on: illegal immigration, crime, and foreign economic competition. Now, in 2020, Donald Trump ran against Joe Biden, and Joe Biden was somewhat of a throwback to an earlier era. Joe Biden was 36 years a senator. He had spent essentially a lifetime in politics, but he was also the former VP, vice president of Obama. And many Americans looked at Joe Biden as, having that Obama connection. And, there are a lot of Americans who still very much viewed, especially when compared with who the Democratic Party chose in 2016, a lot of Americans, were kind of nostalgic for an era where Obama was the candidate, someone who was, again, some people hated him, but for the most part, generally well liked. Whereas Hillary Clinton was a much more polarizing figure in that respect. Um, Joe Biden wins the 2020 election. So he is the president. Joe Biden is from 2020 until, well, to be continued. At the very least, as I'm making this right now, I don't know the outcome of the 2024 election, but perhaps 2024, perhaps 2028, right? Those are the two years that we could say. It was in the aftermath of the election of Joe Biden, which led to the events of January 6, 2021, which we introduced at the very beginning of this chapter. And that was an incident in which the supporters of Donald Trump believed that he had won, actually, Donald Trump had won the 2020 election and that the election was stolen from him. So, January 6, 2021, Trump supporters reached the U.S. Capitol to stop the certification of the 2020 election. The slogan that was chanted during the events of January 26th was "Stop the Steal." Stop the steal. They thought the election was stolen. They thought that Donald Trump should be the president, so they wanted to stop that. Now, Trump also had, much like his predecessors, a very combative relationship with the U.S. Congress. And in fact, it wasn't just the events of January 6, 2021 that led to his impeachment, but in fact, Donald Trump was impeached twice. Trump was impeached twice. The first one had to do with lying / obstructing justice. And when you obstruct justice, you just interfere with an investigation about, really it was kind of about just top secret information. We'll say about the 2016 election. Essentially the claim was that Donald Trump had broken the law by either withholding or threatening information about the 2016 election with a foreign power. And so Donald Trump was impeached for that reason. He was not kicked out. The second impeachment, and this is the one that your textbook mentions, is for inciting. I actually don't know if this is the specific term, but inciting a riot, right? This was actually, do you know the specific quote? Inciting a insurrection. Right, inciting an insurrection. That impeachment, Trump was no longer president. And as I am recording this video currently in 2024, there are still trials going on involving the legal culpability of Donald Trump surrounding the events of 2021. So I guess to be continued. But anyways, you couldn't kick Trump out of office because his term had already ended by the time he was impeached for a second time. But I guess if you were to take away one thing regarding impeachment has only happened 4 times in American history. Right, the process to actually remove the president has only happened 4 times, all the way back with Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction. That was like something like 1866, I'll say. That's just a guess. Bill Clinton 1996 or 1997, and Trump twice, right? Times two. And four impeachments, three people. It's the only time that it's happened in, the 250 or so years of American history. Okay, we got the last couple of sections here. So, section nine, the pandemic. So, the pandemic, again, very recent. So, still kind of figuring out and understanding what are the long term consequences of what happened between, I don't know, 2020 and around 2022, I would say. But the pandemic was around a virus known as COVID 19, and we'll call COVID 19 a highly contagious respiratory disease from China that spread around the world. And it killed approximately 1 million people. The response to this outbreak or this pandemic was in many nations to lock down. And what that meant was that many nations, including the United States, closed schools, shops, restaurants. There was a widespread effort to wear masks. Later on, when the vaccine came out, there was an entire culture that surrounded the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, it was, for those that could deal with the pandemic, if you had a job that was related to technology, for example, many people ended up working from home, but there was a lot of people who were not able to do that. And so for the 2 years, and again, I don't remember exactly when states and countries started opening up again, but at least for the year that the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the world, where people were just confined to their home. And really it was, not only were things closed, but it was illegal to go outside and be in public for fear that the disease might spread even further. For those that could work from home, that was fine. School from home. If all this event, but one of the results was that 10 million people. So first of all, not only 1 million people who lost their life, but 10 million people lost their jobs. And again, we are, certainly in the very last section of the textbook here, the last couple of sections, we're really encroaching upon this time period, right, of just the past year or so, that is nowhere close to being history yet, and still very much fresh in our memories, but still may be important to outline some of the important changes that are here. So the last section of the book is called New Horizons. Again, sort of supposes or alludes to the fact that much of this stuff is still on the future. In terms of the newer generation, we identify them as millennials and Gen Z. This is the generation either born or raised after the year 2000. Millennial is a little bit older. Millennials, I would say, probably can remember a time where the internet didn't exist, whereas Gen Z was born into a world with the internet, with smartphones, with social media, with a lot of these new technologies that have defined, the day. And one thing that we can say about the millennial generation and Gen Z that makes them different from earlier generations is that, in one sense, they are more, I don't know if connected is the right word. I mean, I'm going to use it here. More connected with technology, and more what we'll call socially liberal. Different ideas about certain culture war issues. So, for example, one of these areas of social liberalism is on the front of gay rights, and specifically the issue of gay marriage. And One of the big changes that has happened, really since the year 2000 is American opinions on gay marriage have changed pretty significantly. In 2003, some states legalized gay marriage. And in 2015, via the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges, Supreme Court ruled same-sex marriage a constitutional right. So that's one way in which the millennials and Gen Z have progressed on, um, at least this issue here on some of the social issues, especially as it pertains to gay marriage in this example. An example in which a younger generation is much more connected with technology is, part to do with technological innovation. Apple released the iPhone in 2017. I want to say released in 2007 is what I meant to say. And the iPhone, it connected Americans with the internet in a way that had never, been the case before. And so this would, create really a constant and perpetual connection with the internet, social media, and even the iPhone is capable of taking pictures, with a camera. And not only is it accurate to say that the millennial generation and Gen Z, they're hooked to their iPhone, there's a lot of legitimate concerns that perhaps maybe they are too hooked to their iPhone, that there might be some sort of detrimental effect of having this technology readily available at one's fingertips, right? Especially in the realm of things like social media. One major impact, though, of the growing technology around smartphones is the way that it interacts with politics and social movements. And we have two examples of this sort of equation that is much more prevalent in the early 2000s and going on into the 2010s, and that is, we take social media, right? And social media is platforms like Facebook and TikTok and Snapchat that allow for people to not just connect with each other, but to communicate with millions of people in real time, right? Twitter is probably a better example, or X as it's known today. And social media combined with social movements, combined with political activism, has shaped, some recent and important events. So, for example, probably the best example of the intersection between social media, social movements, and political activism is the movement hashtag Black Lives Matter. This was a movement that really gained, we'll say, momentum from the sharing of viral videos on social media of Black men being killed by police. In fact, Black Lives Matter was a movement that had actually started, I think, back in 2013. So it had been around for a while, but the really big activism around Black Lives Matter didn't happen until 2020, when in fact the pandemic was happening. And that was in response to the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was a Black man killed by police on camera. And the response was approximately 25 million people protested during the lockdowns. Right? Much of the country was going through the COVID pandemic. So much of the country was closed at the time, not just across the nation, but across the world. And so we can see the way in which, social media, in fact, the murder of George Floyd was captured on a cell phone camera, right? That technology allowed for that incident to be sent around the world. And, it caused, I should say, a lot of political movement as a result of it. Another viral social and political movement was the hashtag Me Too movement. The hashtag Me Too movement, this was a movement to expose the sexual crimes of male celebrities. And it further motivated a much broader women's rights movement. So, for example, one of and again, a lot of people participated in the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. Arguably, they might be, I wouldn't be surprised, the largest protests in American history in terms of the sheer number of people who participated in it. But other movements like hashtag Me Too and specifically the election of Donald Trump also motivated other protests. The Women's March, this was what we'll call an anti-Trump women's rights protest held in 2017. And anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million participants. So these are, in terms of sheer numbers, these are some of the largest political demonstrations in all of American history. Now, as far as contemporary politics are concerned, again, this last section here is called New Horizons. So, we're sort of looking forward for what the rest of American history has to entail. But there does seem to be a rather important Supreme Court decision in relationship to women's rights that has just happened recently. And again, kind of hard to see or hard to tell what the long-term implications of this are. But that decision was Dobbs versus Jackson. This was a Supreme Court decision which overturned Roe versus Wade. Right? And remember, Roe versus Wade, that was the Supreme Court case that protected abortion. So now states can and did make abortion illegal. So depending on what state one is in, the overturning of Roe versus Wade meant that states can now ban it if they want to, and several states have already done so. And the trajectory in the future of this, we again sort of stay tuned in this last chapter, I suppose. The last thing that we'll mention here is the changing demographics going on in the United States. Your textbook uses the term Hispanicization. This is the changing and growing population of Hispanics or Latinos in the US, and the shrinking white population. So at the time of the of your textbook, California Hispanics, or technically Latinos, are the largest ethnic group. And just recently, in the 2020 census, the Latino population of Texas is now larger than the white population